In Jesus' name, amen. Verses 14 and 15, although I want to draw your attention to the chapter, but verses 14 and 15, Moses says in prayer to God, I am not able to bear all this people alone because it is too heavy for me. And especially verse 15. If thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand. If I have found favour in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. You know, it might surprise some of you, but some of the greatest spiritual giants have been prone to some of the most vehement bouts of discouragement and depression. I've mentioned already, time to time, Spurgeon, who of course is well documented, suffered bouts of depression. There were various reasons for that, and I mentioned in a message in the life of Moses about how he articulates them and enumerates them in his lectures to my students. One occasion when he was preaching to his congregation, he was extremely discouraged as he mounted the pulpit. And this is what he said to his church. It's something I have to be honest with you, I probably wouldn't be as personable from the pulpit and really let it all out in that sense. But this is what he said to his people. Remember, speaking to 10 or 15,000 people. He said that he felt like Job, who said, my soul chooseth, listen to it, strangling rather than life. That's how he felt as he was preaching the gospel, the greatest news that there ever was. He felt like Job, who said that at this moment in whatever he was going through, he would choose strangling rather than life. He went on in that message to say that I could readily enough have laid violent hands upon myself to escape from the misery of my spirit. He could well have just taken his own life. That's what he's saying. The great Baptist preacher himself, the prince of preachers, the greatest, one of the greatest men to ever mount pulpit steps, said that. He was suicidal. Martin Luther, when you read his works, he often went through bouts of depression. Other notable preachers have written on the subject and been very open and honest on the subject. You could think, for example, of Alexander White and also more recently G. Campbell Morgan. G. Campbell Morgan has a great book named about the feeling of being abandoned by God, and he felt like that in bouts throughout his ministry. Of course, in the Bible there were people who were discouraged as well. The psalm that we sang this morning, Psalm 42 and then Psalm 43 as well, has the question a number of times, why art thou cast down, O my soul, and why art thou disquieted within me? You think of what the Bible describes as the greatest of men amongst women, John the Baptist, a very short ministry. And yet in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, as he was imprisoned for just simply being faithful to God, he sent two messengers to the Messiah himself, to Jesus Christ. And he asked the messengers to ask Jesus Christ this question, art thou he, or should we look for another? In other words, he was so discouraged in prison that he doubted the very Jesus Christ that he had been preaching for some months. The Apostle Paul, of course, was a really remarkable individual. And yet in 2 Corinthians 7 verse 6, he said, nevertheless, God that comforteth those that are cast down. So it seems he's speaking generally, but he goes on to bring it home to himself. 2 Corinthians 7 verse 6, comforteth us by the coming of Titus. So he says that God comforts those who are cast down. And he then explains who he means by saying that God comforted him through Titus coming and helping him and encouraging his soul. He was discouraged, that's the point. You ever been so discouraged, child of God, that you feel like giving up? Or worse still, that you feel like wishing really it was just all over? This life that God has given to us, this little window of time that God has given to you to live for him, to walk for him and witness for him, well, that's exactly where Moses was, because we see in verse 15 that he says it's all getting too much for him. If thou deal thus with me, notice it, this is in prayer to God, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand. If I have found favour in thy sight, let me not see my wretchedness. Moses literally asks God to take away his life. Here are all the marks of someone who is extremely discouraged, and certainly at this moment in time in his life, aged 81, he feels like really it would be better if he were just in heaven and God would take him. Now, between Exodus chapter 19 and Numbers chapter 11, the chapter we're looking at here, 11 months have elapsed. In chapter 10, you find in verse 11, it speaks about a year and 2 months since they left Egypt. So when you have a couple of months and all that we have looked at in these studies, and then you have sort of 8-9 months at the foot of Sinai, or 11 months, that's how long they've been there. But in chapter 10, verses 33 and 34, we read the ark is taken up, the ark of the covenant. The tabernacle is now being given, the pattern has been given to Moses, so the tabernacle worship is now instituted. And in those verses, we read the ark of the covenant's taken up, and the cloud moves them on. Now, as they're moving on, as they have spent some months in Sinai, Moses is really encouraged at the end of chapter 10. I say that because of verse 35. Notice how Moses prays, "Rise up, Lord, let your enemies be scattered, let them that hate thee flee before thee." You see, Moses getting up, he's been here for some months, and he's just in prayer to God. He really is on the mountaintop, not just literally, but physically, but also emotionally and spiritually. Lord, rise up. We're going to move now. We want you to deal with our enemies in front of us. Arise, Lord, let your enemies be scattered. And yet, 3 days elapse. That's right, child of God. Just 3 days after taking up sticking and moving on, we find Moses uttering this statement in verse 15 before God. "Lord, if you favor me, kill me. Take me, my life away, that I might not see my wretchedness." Just in a matter of days, he has gone from the mountaintop to, "Lord, take me. Let me not see how wretched I am. I don't want to see it, Lord. Better that you just take me now." Ever been there, child of God? Ever been an hour of your life where you felt despairing, discouraged, just tempted to give up? But as you look away at the head, it only seems darkness. Why is it that people do give up in the work of God and the service of God? Why is it that approximately, certainly in America anyway, that 50% of pastors do not last longer than 7 years in the ministry? Why is it that full-time servants, missionaries, come home after a number of months or years and they never return to foreign service? Why is it, child of God, that perhaps you've been involved in a work in the past, but you've given up? It's because of discouragement. Yes, other reasons sometimes can be a factor. There can be health, there can be family, other commitments. But a main reason, my friend, is discouragement. Discouragement. And that's where Moses is. I think we can see it this morning. This is exactly where Moses is. He's so discouraged, he feels like quitting. So let me just highlight to you, I believe, 3 reasons that Moses felt like quitting, and that you and I at times can feel like quitting as well. In the early verses of this chapter, we find the issue of despondency or discouragement. Despondency. Look at verses 5 and 6. We remember the fish that we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic, but now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. And we read in verse 10, as a result of all this, that Moses was displeased. Moses was displeased. Now God was displeased in verse 10, but Moses was displeased. And the word displeased, it means in the Hebrew discouraged. So all of the events of this chapter lead to Moses being discouraged, downcast, depressed, you might say. Now, what were they really complaining about, the people here? Well, someone summed it up very nicely, and they said they were complaining about what they had, and they were complaining about what they hadn't. What they had and what they hadn't. What do I mean by that? Well, in these verses, you see very, very clearly what they had. God had provided for them manna. You read of that in verses 7 and 8 and following, the description there of the manna. And you find the people here, what are they doing? Verses 5 and 6, oh, we remember Egypt. We remember the fish, the melons, the lovely cucumbers, the garlic, the onions. Oh, we remember all that we used to have. But all that we sadly have now, it's nothing in comparison to what we used to have. We just have, and you read these verses, we just have this manna. This manna that you've given to us, Lord. And mixed in amongst all of this is the hardship and the difficulty that they have experienced as well. Verse 6, our soul is dried away, nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. We're dried up, Lord, and all we have is this manna and this hardship that we have experienced. You see, they had hardships and they didn't like this. They had manna, they didn't like this. You make it very clearly in verse 8. They went about, they gathered it, ground it, baked it, caked it, added oil, they did whatever they could to dress it up. But at the end of the day, it was just manna. Just manna. Manna for breakfast, manna for lunch, manna for dinner, and manna for supper. Now in verse 5, it talks really there, it says there, we remember what we ate in Egypt. And yet they forget the hardships. This is the thing, just a year on, they forget the 400 odd years of hardship and rigor and all that they experienced in Egypt. They have forgotten all of this, child of God. They have forgotten it all. And so here they are, they're complaining about what they had, manna, they're complaining about what they hadn't, all of the melons and the onions, etc., etc. Chapter 11, verse 1 tells us, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. You see, Moses heard this, and it was discouraging him, and the Lord heard it, and it displeased him. Let me just stop and pause before we go on. And let me ask you, do you genuinely see any of this in your life? I think, if you're honest, you do. We complain about what we have, and we have so much. So much. And we complain about what we haven't, instead of being thankful for what God has given us, and also thankful for what keeps from us, and at times what we haven't. Because sometimes the Lord knows if he gives us more, he knows we'll not handle more. He knows that we'll not trust him or not thank him, and we'll trust in self. Oh, child of God, we need to learn to be patient with God's timetable, don't we? George MacDonald said they didn't mind slavery to sin. It was slavery to God that troubled them. And this was the people of God. And so here we find that the result of all of this, as I have said, it displeased Moses. It discouraged Moses. Now Moses, at the start of all this, Moses had been praying for them. Verse 2, the people cried to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So what had actually happened, as I said in verse 1, the Lord heard this complaining of the people. What would God do? Look at verse 1 again. The anger of the Lord was kindled, the fire of the Lord burnt among them, consumed them, that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. Because of their complaining and murmuring about what they had and what they hadn't, God actually sent a fire and destroyed some of them. This is how serious this was. And I've mentioned 1 Corinthians 10 a number of times in this message. You read in 1 Corinthians 10 verses 11 and 12 and so on, and it speaks there about them being destroyed of the destroyer because of their murmuring. God, he makes it very clear here that this murmuring, this complaining amongst one another and to Moses, it was literally destroying them. Literally destroying them, and it was destroying Moses, because verse 10, he was discouraged. Verse 15, he was so discouraged, he felt like taking his own life. Now, what's the lesson we learn here, child of God? We learn a very simple lesson. That it is a serious thing to have a murmuring and a complaining spirit. And whilst God may never send fire amongst us, what does that kind of a spirit do? That kind of a spirit destroys. Let me be clear here. Destroys the people of God. It destroys the people of God. Because what happens if you have this kind of a murmuring and critical spirit? Well, you share that with someone. And they share that with someone. And they share that with someone. And you know what you have? Before you know it, you have exactly what you have here in Numbers chapter 11. We read here in these verses, verse 10, throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses was so displeased. It started with 1 or 2. It finished, my friend, with 2 million. Every man at the door of his tent. Oh, they were complaining now. It spread throughout the people of God. And it led some amongst them, like Moses, to feel so discouraged that he felt like giving up. Be very careful, child of God. Be very careful with what you say and how you say it. Because you can actually do the devil's business in uttering, whether it's a criticism or whether it's even a discouragement. You can say that yes, I want to encourage the people of God and I want to be a blessing. But if that does not square with conduct, then you are being a discouragement. And what you do is you discourage yourself, but you also discourage others. And it's amazing how very quickly a body of people and a congregation can be destroyed by this kind of a spirit. May God ever keep that kind of a thing out of Ballymagurney. Because it can destroy a people. It can destroy a people. And it can drive people to such a place in their life where they feel like Moses. Lord, I'm so discouraged that I feel like giving up. You ever been there, child of God? You ever thought that just so discouraged where you just can't go on? I know some of you have been there. And yet you've stuck in and you've kept going. Oh, my friend, such damage can be done. Such damage can be done. Verse 1 tells us that the fire of the Lord burnt among them. And verse 3 tells us that he called the name of the place Taberah. It means literally burning. This place was actually named after what God had done as a memorial on their journeys. So they wouldn't go back to this kind of a spirit again. Of course, the one thing to remember in all of this in verse 1 is it displeased the Lord and the Lord heard it. In many ways, it does matter who hears it, but the Lord hears it. The Lord hears it. Spurgeon has an infamous quote in this very passage in Numbers 11. And he says, the gift of grumbling is largely dispensed among those who have no other talents. That's quite firm by Spurgeon. But he's right. He's right. Proverbs 17, verse 22 tells us that a merry heart doeth good like medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. Do you ever meet someone who has a wounded and broken spirit? What does it do? It dries the bones in the sense that it dries the... Well, what are bones? Bones keep us together, don't they? And he's essentially saying that a broken spirit, an individual who has a wounded spirit, who is a complainer, that it literally sucks the life from you. It's like drying up the bones. The bones need to be moist. The bones need to have moist marrow in them. And when they dry up, they're so brittle and fragile, aren't they? And that's what a wounded spirit can do. The issue of despondency. Another issue, secondly, that led to Moses really feel like giving up as we find these utterances is the issue of dispensability. The issue that this led to him feeling that he was really needed when in a way he wasn't. Look at verse 4. The mixed multitude that was amongst them fell a lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again, and said, who shall give us flesh to eat? What was the problem that Moses faced? The problem was this, that there were the mixed multitude described here in these verses, and they were coming to Moses. They were the ones who started this complaining. And they came to him and they said, well, things were better in Egypt, and all of the rest with it. Now in chapter 10, verse 38, who were these mixed multitude? Well, you find out who they were. They were essentially non-Jews who attached themselves to the people of God as they were leaving Egypt. Who were they really then? They were essentially non-believers. That's who they were. They were people who loosely attached themselves, but they did not fully commit to the worship of the Lord. Now remember again, let me just bring you back to all of this. In verse 2 we read that Moses was praying for them at the start of all this, and the fire was quenched. But it seems that this gets so much for Moses that rather than praying, verse 10, we read it displeased the Lord, and it displeased Moses. So Moses is praying for them that God would not extinguish them or exterminate them through fire. And we read, at times the fire was quenched. But now Moses, my friend, well, he's not praying anymore. No, he's discouraged. This issue is spread, verse 10. Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent. You imagine Moses mingling with the 2 million, and he goes to this one, he goes to Asher, and he goes to Naphtali and to Dan, and they're all complaining and they're all weeping about this. Verses 11 and 12. How does Moses respond to this? Well, he used to pray, but verses 11 and 12 tells us, "Hast thou afflicted thy servant? Wherefore have I not found favour in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all the people upon me? Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them?" Verse 13 really shows us where he's at. "Whence do I have flesh to give all this people?" Verse 14, "It's too heavy for me, I'm not able to bear." Moses comes to God feeling all of this, and well, they want flesh. Lord, I'll just give them flesh. Now, Moses is thinking so logically here because he's so discouraged that he feels that it's actually incumbent upon him to give them flesh. All the while God had provided flesh or quail for them on 2 occasions. But Moses comes to God and says, "Lord," it's amazing, verse 13, "Whence do I have flesh to give all this people?" Moses, you're in the middle of the wilderness. Moses, it's God that has provided man and flesh. Moses feels like he needs to give in and give flesh to 2 million people in the middle of a wilderness where there is none. It's all getting in on him. What do you have here? You have an illogical response to unrealistic demands. That's what you have here. This feeling of indispensability. And this can cause you to be discouraged, child of God, where someone can ask you something illogical or unreasonable, and you feel, well, I must do this. I must give in. I must do whatever it is, whether it's the work of God, whether it's home, whether it's family, whether it's the public realm, whatever it might be. And what happens is when you don't meet the demand laid upon you, you feel discouraged. You feel like a failure because you can't do all that you believe you should do. Again, you ever been there, so overwhelmed with so many things to do and right and good and godly things to do, but you've been so overwhelmed and you can't do it all, and so you feel like a failure? This was so heavy for Moses. Let me just remind you, this was so heavy for Moses, verses 11 through 14, that he said in verse 15, "Lord, if you favour me, take my life now." That's how hard this was for Moses. Certainly no laughing matter. Now, this was the problem that Moses faced. Think with me about the proposal then that Moses received. Verses 16 and following, God gives Moses similar counsel that he had done 11 months previously in Exodus 18. Remember what happened in Exodus 18? Jethro, the father-in-law, came out to meet Moses. And of course there was this counsel ultimately given by God through Jethro to appoint others to help. Now God gives him similar counsel again. Verse 17, he tells him to take 70 others, 70 elders, and the promise is this: "I will take of the Spirit which is upon thee, Moses, and will put it upon them." It's not that Moses would have less of his Spirit, but that these 70 men would be clothed to help Moses in this work, to meet the needs generally of the people. Now, verse 25, you read then of these men, what happens? Well, they're called out from the camp, or called to the tabernacle. Remember, it's now instituted. And as they're called to the tabernacle, Moses' Spirit rests in these men, and you read of them prophesying. Now, you read of them prophesying once. You don't read of them prophesying over and over again. You read of them prophesying once. Why? Because this prophesying, this supernatural prophesying, declaring the word of God, was establishing them, was validating them in the eyes of the people. You see, it was always God's design for Moses to be the prophet, but it was also God's design for him to have help as he declared the word of the Lord. Now, something happened in verse 26. Follow this with me. Look at verse 26. There remained 2 of the men in the camp, so they didn't go to the tabernacle. One was Eldad, the other Medad, and the Spirit rested upon them. So 68 went to the tabernacle, to the middle of the people of God, but 2 did not go with them. And yet, you then find in these verses, I'm just going through them quickly, verses 27, 28, 29, a young man who has a like for Moses, who obviously appreciates his leadership, who prays for Moses and sees the good that Moses has done and what God has called him to. A young man comes to Moses and he essentially levels the accusation against these men that they need to be restrained. He reports this to Moses. They're not with you in the tabernacle, Moses. They're still in the camp. Now notice verse 29. How does Moses respond to this? And this shows the humility of Moses, this meekest man of all the earth. Verse 29, Moses said to him, envious thou for my sake? Would God that all the Lord's prophets, and that the Lord would put his spirit upon them. What you see here in Moses is this. Moses is happy that others were helping him. He wasn't after the glory for himself. He just wanted the work to be done by individuals who were qualified to do that work, that God has qualified. And there's a lesson here, child of God, very simple lesson. And I've just raced through that chapter and well, we trust quick time. Lesson here is this, is that when you face unrealistic expectation, remember, still this feeling of indispensability, still dealing with this issue, I need to, but I feel like a failure when I can't. When you face unrealistic expectation and you're discouraged that you can't meet that expectation, it's not wrong to ask for help or to move that responsibility on. It's not. That's what Moses did here. More than happy. In fact, he said, would God that all the Lord's people were prophets and his spirit rested upon them. You see, our tendency, because of our pride, to be honest, is that we try to do everything ourselves. We don't like to ask others for help. And yet the meekest of all the men of the earth realized that if God was ever to get this work done, that he needed the help of others. He wants to see his work, his kingdom, his cause advance through others. The best remedy, child of God, therefore, for not quitting, very simply, at times is to swallow your pride and ask for help. Because that's what happens. Oh, I must do this, must do that. You know, and if only you would just ask for a little bit of help. And if this is at home, ask for help at home, your spouse. This is the work of God. You can translate this into so many areas of life. Don't be afraid when things get on top of you to either move a responsibility on. You go into so many realms, and so I haven't time to really plumb the depth of this, but move a responsibility on or ask for help. F.B. Meyer is a wonderful work in Moses. And he said in this occasion in Moses' life, there is no test more searching than this. Am I eager for God's kingdom to come through others as through myself? Would you be as happy, child of God, to see God advance his cause through someone else as well as through yourself? I can't go down the route of the issue of jealousy because, to be honest with you, that's what chapter 12 is all about. But that's a searching and probing question, isn't it? Would you be happy for God to bless others as well as yourself? Honestly now, search your heart out. Despondency, dispensability. There's also, lastly and very quickly, the issue of distraction. All of this that's going on in Moses' life is a distraction. Verse 15, we clearly see that he's lost sight of what it's all about. Now, what has he been distracted from? Well, he's been distracted from God's promise. How many times has God promised to Moses, I'll be with you? You know, way back in Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush, you know what you find? God promised Moses, I will be with you. In Exodus 33 a few weeks ago, what did we look at? My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. And God kept his promise. Chapter 10, verse 34, the cloud went with them. What was the pillar? What was the cloud? What was the fire? It was the very promise of God's presence with Moses. So in chapter 10, verse 34, when God moves Moses on and the pillar comes down, rests in the tabernacle, God is keeping this promise. God has promised Moses that I'll be with you. And yet look at chapter 11, verse 11 now. Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant, as wherefore I have not found favour in thy sight. Lord, all of this is an evidence of you not favouring me. Lord, you're not with me. That's what he's saying in verse 11. But God has just said that he was with him, and God has demonstrated this in the cloud. And for 3 days, he's watched this cloud just come and move the people on to this 3 days outside of Sinai, where they were now. You see, all of this stress and all of this criticism and all of this hardship, it's caused Moses to lose sight of the fact that God promised he would be with him, and God answered Moses' prayer in Exodus 33 as well. And this can happen, child of God, can't it? The issue of being distracted can lead to you being discouraged. It's so simple, isn't it? But you lose sight of all that God has promised. All that God has called you to, and the help that he has promised to give you and to be with you and to go whithersoever you would go and be with you whatsoever you would do. But what happens is when we're discouraged, we lose sight very simply of the promises of God. And very often I feel that that is just what causes people to withdraw from really going on with God. We lose sight of what God has promised because we're too discouraged. That we are today, beloved, lose sight of all that God has promised. He's promised it time and time again in the life of Moses, and we have seen that. And God has promised you time after time after time, fear not, I'll be with you wherever you go, whatever you do. Even should you go into all the world and preach the gospel, there I will be with you to the end of the world and the end of the age. And yet we lose sight because we're discouraged. Distracted from God's promise, but distracted from God's power. Verse 21, let's just finish with this. Moses said, the people among whom I am, as if God didn't know, are 600,000 footmen. And thou hast said, I will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. Shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Lord, do you know how many people there are? There's 600,000 soldiers here. Lord, how are we going to feed them all? He's still discouraged here. He's still trying to try and conjure up how he can get food for all the army. And God had to remind Moses in verse 23, is the Lord's hand waxed short? Moses, never worry about it. I have provided manna for over a year. Moses, my hand is not waxed short. And in fact, the amazing thing about this is that God granted their request but sent leanness into their souls. And you read on in this chapter that he gave them meat and quail for a whole month, to the point where they were sick of it, and as the Bible describes it, literally coming out of their nostrils. He gave them what they wanted, and he provided it for them. But the key is this: Moses, you have lost sight of God's power. Here we are in the wilderness. You have seen so much, so many manifestations of God's power. Moses, leave this to me. I am the Almighty One, and I will deal with this. Moses lost sight of it. There's that tendency, isn't there, child of God, to lose sight of the power of God. We need to be reminded often, like Abraham and Jeremiah, is anything too hard for the Lord? And others, I'm sure, who have received that promise as well. Nothing's too hard for the Lord, child of God. But you and I, because of discouragement, can lose sight of it. Watch Man Nee, and I'll finish with this. In his sermon on the feeding of the 5,000, that most encouraging Chinese Christian, he said, in his sermon, expecting the Lord's blessing, everything in our service for the Lord is dependent on his blessing. The meeting of need is not dependent on the supply hand, but on God's blessing resting on that supply. God promises power and blessing. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, child of God. Don't let discouragement distract you from all that God has promised and all that God will give to you if you but seek him for it. Reasons we feel like quitting. And I trust this has been helpful and encouraging this morning. Let's just bow in prayer and commit our time